All right. So everyone has their evolution notes out. So today we're going to talk about the evidence for evolution. So we're going to look at the facts that we have collected over the many years of research and studying. And we're going to look at the facts that support the theory of evolution. Okay. So first, I want you to watch this video. So, I want you to pay attention, listen, and get off your phones and watch the video.
Stated Clearly presents. What is the evidence for evolution? The theory of biological evolution makes two very bold claims about living creatures. First, all living things on Earth are related. They evolved from a common ancestor. Second, the evolution of living things is powered by natural processes, things which can be studied and understood. But is there really any evidence that these two claims are true? Yes. There are so many observable facts from so many different fields of study that the only way we can even begin to talk about them is to group them into categories or lines of evidence. To keep things simple, here we'll focus on evolution's first claim that all living things on Earth are related. We cannot tackle the entire tree of life at once. After all, there's an estimated 8.7 million species alive today. So instead, we'll focus most of our attention on one fairly small but fascinating branch of the evolutionary tree, cetaceans. This branch includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Biologists tell us that all these creatures are closely related, and that the entire group evolved from an ancient four-legged land mammal. Instead of taking their word for it, let's look at the facts. We'll start by looking at a few from the field of comparative anatomy, the study of differences and similarities between living things. Whales live in water, and from a distance, they sort of look like giant fish. A close inspection of their anatomy, however, tells us a very different story. Whales, just like land mammals but unlike fish, have placentas and give live birth. They feed milk to their young. They are warm-blooded, which is extremely rare for a fish. And whales do not have gills. Instead, just like us, they breathe air with two fully developed lungs. Whales don't seem to have noses like mammals do. Instead, they breathe through blowholes coming out the tops of their heads. Some whales have two blowholes which almost look like nostrils. But dolphins and porpoises only have one. Surprisingly, if you look at their skulls, you find that the blowhole splits into two nasal passages inside the head. Could it be that the blowhole is actually a highly modified mammal nose? It looks that way, but we'll need more evidence to be sure. Many whales have hair, just like land mammals. In this photograph, you can actually see the whiskers of this baby gray whale as he rests his chin on mama's back. Strangely, whales have arm, wrist, hand, and finger bones inside their front flippers. Here's a photo of these bones, the same bones that bats, hippos, and people have in their front appendages. One bone, two bones, wrist, hand, and finger bones. Modern whales do not have back legs, but they do have a strange pair of bones where the hind legs should be. Here's a picture of these bones from a bowhead whale. They almost look like shriveled hip, thigh, and shin bones. This one even has a ball and socket joint between the hip and thigh bone, just like the ball and socket joint in your own hip. Is this resemblance a mere coincidence, or are these real leg bones? Perhaps leftovers from the whale's evolutionary history? Before we draw any bold conclusions, let's see if a completely separate line of evidence will confirm our suspicions. Embryology is the study of how creatures develop before being born or hatching from an egg. Here we see a dolphin and a human embryo side by side at similar stages of development. Notice that they both have what look like arm buds and leg buds. In humans, the leg buds grow to become legs. In whales, they grow for a while but then stop, effectively fading away as the rest of the whale continues to grow. These are all photographs of a common dolphin at different stages of growth. Notice that early on, we see two nostril grooves on the front of the face, just like you'd expect in a puppy or a human. As the dolphin continues to grow, the nostrils migrate to the top of the head and fuse together, becoming the dolphin's blowhole. So far, we have multiple facts from two independent lines of study, comparative anatomy and embryology, that are both telling us the same story. The ancestors of whales were once four-legged land creatures. Will the fossil record act as a third witness, confirming this idea? These are two species of extinct basilosaurid whales. These animals are known from multiple well-preserved skeletons, and they appear to have lived side by side roughly 34 to 40 million years ago. In this photograph, we're looking down at the top of a basilosaurid skull. This is not a model or a cast. These are the actual bones which were pulled from the ground. Notice that the nasal opening is not on the top of the head like those of modern whales, and not at the end of the snout like those of land mammals. Instead, it's right in the middle. This is an intermediate species, exactly what evolution tells us we should find. At the back end of a basilosaurid's body, there are small, yet fully developed hips, legs, ankle, feet, and toe bones. These legs are far too small for walking on land, but they may have been useful while mating or for scratching away parasites and itchy skin. Evolutionary theory tells us that the further we go back in time, the harder it should be to distinguish whales from normal land mammals. Meet Myocetus. The hip bones of Myocetus seem sturdy enough to walk on land, but this animal is considered to be a whale for many reasons. Their skeletons have all been found among fossils of sea creatures, which tells us they live in the ocean. Their short legs, combined with long, flat fingers and toes, suggest they were strong swimmers with webbed hands and feet. Here we see the bottom side of a Myocetus jaw and skull. Her teeth match those of the basilosaurid whales we saw earlier, and the unique structures of her middle ear bones match those of basilosaurid whales and modern whales. Myocetus appears to be a walking whale. Scientists have found the fossils of many ancient whale-like mammals and continue to find more. Together, these fossils blur the line between four-legged land mammals and fully aquatic modern whales, solidifying the idea that whales indeed evolved from land creatures. Now let's look at a fourth line of evidence, DNA. DNA molecules contain chemical codes which act like recipes for living things. Without ever looking at bones, embryos, or anatomy, researchers can compare the DNA code of different living creatures to find out who is most closely related to who. Whale DNA has been compared to all kinds of other animals, fish, sea lions, you name it. And so far, the closest genetic match is to the pudgy, water-loving hippopotamus. This does not mean that whales evolved from hippos, but if this genetic finding is correct, whales and hippos both evolved from a common ancestor that lived roughly 54 million years ago. At first, the link between whales and hippos surprised researchers because whales are mainly carnivores. They eat things like fish and small crustaceans. Hippos, on the other hand, are mostly vegetarian. A closer look, however, reveals that hippos and whales actually share many strange features, some of which may have come from their common ancestor. Ancient walking whales have specially shaped ankle bones found only in hippos and the close relatives of hippos. Just like whales, hippos are known to give birth and even nurse their young underwater. They both have multi-chambered stomachs, which is common for herbivores, but is almost unheard of for meat-eating mammals. They are both missing a coat of fur, and here's a fun fact. Whales and hippos are among the only mammals on Earth that have internal testicles. So there you have it. 4 independent lines of evidence all tell us the exact same story. Whales evolved from 4-legged land mammals. But the history of whales is not the only evolutionary history that we've been able to work out. We know from fossils, DNA, embryology, biology and many other lines of evidence that bird wings are actually modified arms and claws. Birds evolved from dinosaur-like ancestors. We can also clearly see that bat wings evolved from five-fingered hands, very similar to those of monkeys and shrews. We found that humans share a fairly recent common ancestor with chimpanzees, that mammals evolved from reptile-like creatures. Those reptile-like creatures evolved from amphibian-like creatures. Those amphibian-like creatures evolved from fish-like creatures. And fish, if you go back far enough, share a common ancestor with segmented worms. So to sum things up, thousands of observable facts from completely independent fields of study have come together to tell us the exact same story. All living things on Earth are related. I'm John Perry, and that's a basic overview of the evidence for evolution stated clearly.
Alright. So now let's look more closely at all those lines of evidence. Alright, so real quick, before we do get started on that, I do want to remind you, you have a quiz tomorrow on classification. So not evolution, so nothing from this PowerPoint. The very first PowerPoint that we did. Go look back through that. Go look through your classification notes. Go look through the classification review packet number 4 that we did in class. Your quiz tomorrow is only on classification, not evolution. Okay? Alright. So evidence for evolution. The first line of evidence that we are going to look at is our fossil record. And what a fossil record is, or what the fossil record is a giant catalog of all of the fossils that we have found on Earth. So this includes all of the known species that we have today, and all of the extinct species that are no longer here with us. Okay, so all of the bones that we have. Okay, so anytime a fossil is found and dug up, it is excavated very carefully. It is cataloged, it is studied, pictures are taken, a lot of things happening, but it's added to your fossil record. And then that fossil record serves as a way to compare species, whether they be other extinct species or whether they be extinct species that we have living today. So it just serves as a way for you to compare and see where these possible ancestors, evolutionary ancestors, came from and what those ancestors are, and it gives you a lot of information. So that's your fossil record. Your another line of evidence are called homologous structures. So the prefix homo means one. So homologous structures are species that have the same structure. Now, those structures can look a little different, and they do look a little different, but essentially they are the same structure. And where we see this the most is the bone structure of different species. So very commonly you will see the arm of a human, the leg of some animal, the flipper of some sea-dwelling animal, and then the wing of some other animal. So these 4 different, very different specialized limbs, if you look on them at the outside, you would argue that they look completely different, so they have no similarities. But if you actually look at the anatomy and the physiology, so the bone structure and how those bones work and what those bones are used for, if you look at those, then you would see the similarities that are present. So all of these species, these 4 species right here, they all have a single upper bone. So our upper arm is one single bone. All of these species have a single upper bone, followed by 2 bones connected together. So our lower arm is 2 bones connected together. So we have that, a cat leg has that, a whale flipper. So even though they're not as long and as thin, they're a little short and stubby, but they are still there. And then bat wings, the bones in bat wings are very long and very skinny. So they might look a little different, but they're still there. So then we have our lower arm followed by our wrist bones. A cat leg has wrist bones. Whales have wrist bones too. Again, they're probably just squished little stubby things. And then bats and other birds, they do have wrist bones. You can see them if you get close up to it. Whereas they're very, very small, so you might think that they don't exist, but they are there. They're just very, very, very small. And then finally, your finger bones are going to look very different depending on what you need those fingers to do. So our fingers need to grasp things, so they're going to be fairly long and nimble. A cat, they really don't do that much. I mean, they walk on them and they use them to hold things down, but they don't really like grasp anything like we do. Okay, they kind of use their paw as a whole paw, not just individual fingers. Whales, they need to be able to push water out of their way, so they're going to have long, pretty thick bones that are going to hold a lot of muscle that's going to move that water out of the way. And then bats kind of have to do the same thing, but they have to push air out of the way. So they need long bones, long finger bones, but they don't really need very thick bones because they're trying to fly. If they have thick, heavy bones, they're not going to be able to fly. So they all look different a little bit, but they are essentially the same bone structure. So those are your homologous structures. And the next time that you are at a museum and you see some skeletons of different animals, depending on what museum you're in, I implore you to look very closely at the differences and the similarities that they have. Because you may not realize it, but the leg or arm bone of a black bear is fairly similar to the wing bone structure of a penguin. They are pretty similar. They are homologous structures. Another type of structure that we have is the vestigial structure. And yesterday I mentioned the fact that whales have hip bones. Hip bones are used to walk on land. So why do whales have hip bones if they don't walk on land? Well, it is a vestigial structure. It is a bone structure. Usually it has to do with bones, or it's anything that was once useful but now is no longer useful, or now it's no longer used by that organism. So again, whales do not need to walk on land, but they still have hip bones because their ancestor that they evolved from probably had back limbs, and so they had hip bones, and their ancestor probably somewhat walked on land, so they had even better hip bones and leg bones. So over time, through evolution, slowly but surely, those back legs and those hip bones are going to go away and disappear. Those are vestigial structures. Another line of evidence that we have is through the study of embryology, or looking at the embryos and comparing those embryos to other embryos of other species. So if species evolved from a single ancestor, so if your species has a common ancestor that they evolved from, they should look similar through the early stages, at least the early stages of embryonic development. And that is what we see. So we have a human, a monkey, a pig, a chicken, and a salamander. And very early on in their embryonic development, they look fairly similar. They have eyes, they have a backbone, they have what looks like to be legs coming in. They have all these things that are similar, but they have also differences based on adaptations that they have gotten throughout the many years through evolution. So for example, your chicken embryo is going to have a larger yolk sac. For some reason or another, it does. And then us, at the very early stages of development, we start to see what are known as gill slits. So we do have evidence that at some point in our embryonic development, we had the ability to produce gills. Now, further along, they start to go away, but you can see them very early in embryonic development. Yes, Matthew?
Are scientists able to adjust, let's say a salamander, are they able to adjust it so it becomes its original
Not necessarily, because you're missing DNA and you don't have that missing DNA. So you can't just put random stuff in there. And a lot of the times what will happen is that the embryo, for whatever reason, will realize, hey, this isn't working, something's not right, so let's just start over from scratch, and it just won't be an embryo anymore. So no, I don't think they have, because I don't think they have that ability to. But who knows? Maybe they have. All right, so another line of evidence that we can use to support the theory of evolution is molecular biology. So molecular biology is a branch of biology. So there are many branches of biology. That's why y'all have to learn so many different things throughout the year. So molecular biology looks at just the DNA of organisms, and it compares the DNA of organisms and looks at the similarities and the differences. So if you remember, if you think back, amino acids make proteins. Proteins are basically what tell your cells what to do, how to do it, and what to look like. So that's how we have 4 arms, a head, all this stuff. So the differences, the more different your DNA is, obviously, the farther away, the least related you are to that. But if your DNA is pretty similar, then that argues that you are very similar to that species. So what they did was they looked at the DNA of many different animals, like the video said, and it has come to be known that gorillas only have about 1 major difference in DNA compared to humans. But that does not say that gorillas or humans evolved from each other. So that is not what that is saying. That is saying that these 2 species, because they are very similar in DNA, in their molecular biology, they probably, more than likely, had a common ancestor that they each evolved from. Okay? Going back to the video at the very end. So if you end up believing in evolution, essentially what the theory is and how we evolved and what we evolved from is that we evolved from fish. So we did not evolve from monkeys, we evolved from fish. So what the theory is what happened was millions of years ago, listen, millions of years ago, there was a lot more water on Earth than there is today. So the oceans were very high, there was only a little bit of land. So what happened was that your water-dwelling animals were chilling out, being cool. For whatever reason, something catastrophic was happening, and the sea levels were beginning to shrink. So your seas were getting smaller, and so these animals were having to come out of the water and survive and adapt and modify themselves in order to live in a land environment. Please let me finish. I will answer your questions, just let me finish. Okay? So those land mammals that have evolved from the water-dwelling animals, that is where we evolved from. So that is the theory. Yes, Matthew?
Has there ever been like a human that was born with gills?
I think it has happened before, but it is very seldom, and I don't think that it's actually gills. It's more or less like very, very like crude, like remnants of gills. But I do think it has happened at some point. Yes, Cody?
But like, how do you evolve from fish if like you take a fish out of water?
Okay, so evolution is through a long period of time. So yes, if you take a fish out of the ocean, it will die eventually.
But over millions of years.
But over millions of years and through adaptation and natural selection and mutations and all these things that are affecting evolution, you have a series of species that have been better equipped at living in a more land-dwelling environment. So they did not just spring out of the ocean and decide, hey, I'm going to be a land mammal. Over millions and millions of years, they slowly developed the ability to fully live on land. Okay? Okay. Yes, John Aldi.
Going back to what you said about the humans having there has been a study on a tribe that has adapted to last longer underwater.
Mm-hmm.
Where they unlike a human would last like 3 minutes, they can last 10.
Yep. There are humans that have the ability to hold their breath for 10 minutes, where I think the average for humans, for an average human is what, like 2 to 3 minutes? Also, some people may have more, they may have a more evident of webbing in between their hands and their feet. So webbing is another form of living in water. So some humans may have a little bit more skin in between their toes and their hands. Yes, Reese.
So there was this video that I saw in like 6th grade.
Okay.
And the girl was like feet were like together.
Uh-huh.
Like, you know, like
Yes. Yes.
Is that
So that could be something different. That's not necessarily like an evidence of us being evolved from. That could be more or less something happened in her embryonic development where for some reason her legs just didn't split. So instead of forming 2 distinct legs, something was happening in her cells that told her cells, hey, you are not going to split, you're going to make one single leg.
Yeah, it was kind of just like a
Yeah.
thing.
I think I saw that too. But yeah, it's not necessarily going back to like, oh, this proves that we evolved from fish. That is more or less like a birth defect with this one individual.
We all might have one leg.
We might, who knows? Over millions and millions and millions of years, who knows what will happen? All right, so stepping away a little bit really quickly from the theory of evolution, so just put that to the side for a minute. We need to discuss a thing called the Hardy Weinberg principle. And what the Hardy Weinberg principle is these two guys basically came together and they said that based on a set of rules, so what your population, so real quick, let's assume that we are a population, okay? We in this class are a population of humans, okay? So us, our population, we can study the different types of natural selection and the modes of evolution of our particular population at this particular time in history by comparing it to a set of rules that our population should be obeying. Okay, so you have a model. So this is the Hardy Weinberg Equilibrium, is just a model that you use as a comparison. So this model says that these are the rules that your population should be following. If they're not following these rules, then that means there's some kind of natural selection, some kind of evolutionary change happening, and you can use your comparison to figure out what type of natural selection is happening. So what we need to know of is we need to know the rules that our population should be following. So our rules are as follows. 1, we have to be a very large population. So if we take into account our population right here, just this classroom, we have about 30 individuals, give or take. I know we have some absent kids, but we should have about between 30 and 32 individuals, okay? That is not a large population. That is a very small population. So in a perfect situation, in a perfect imaginary world, we would have the whole population of the school or the whole population of fish hawk and so on and so forth. But we don't. We have this population right here in real life. This is the one that we're studying. Okay, we are studying room 525 at 11:45 in the morning, afternoon, whatever you want to call it. Okay? So our second rule that our population has to follow is that there can't be any migration. So nothing can be coming in, so no new species can be coming into the population, and no species can be leaving the population. Well, if we're looking at our population right now, that has already not happened, because second semester, a lot of y'all got schedule changes, and some of you have come into the classroom and are new to the classroom, and we had people leaving the classroom. So in a real world situation, this does not happen. You have individuals, you have species migrating back and forth between populations. Anytime that they have migration, anytime you have people coming and going, you are going to have genes genes being influential into your population. So you're going to have new genes coming in, you're going to have old genes going out. So the process of migration introduces the diversity that we want in our population. Okay. Number 3, no mutation. So mutations, remember, are a way that we get genetic change, a way that we get genetic diversity. So mutations aren't always bad. Sometimes they're good. Sometimes they have no effect. But what this means, no mutation means, is that anytime your cells are replicating, anytime you have transcription, anytime you have translation, anytime that you have new cells being created, nothing is going wrong. All that information is copy and pasted perfectly. When you are putting your DNA with someone else's DNA, it's going to come together and make a perfect, not wrong at all instruction set for your offspring. So we all know that that typically does not happen in the real world. Okay? We usually have a lot of mutations, but that's how we get our genetic diversity, and that's what we want. Number 4, random mating. So random mating is pretty much what it says. You're going to go out and pick a random person to mate with. Okay? That does not happen in the animal kingdom specifically, because animals like to have a list of characteristics that they look for in a mate. So, for example, penguins, they collect rocks. Female penguins are going to pick male penguins that collect a lot more prettier rocks. If you're not good at collecting pretty rocks, then you're probably not mating. Okay? Whereas fish, so if you didn't know how fish mate, here you go. Fish, the female just lays her eggs wherever she wants, and the male comes up behind her and outside fertilizes the eggs, and then they go on their merry way, and the universe just decides what happens with those eggs. Okay? So it's more or less like fish mating. It's just, it happens randomly, and the universe gets to decide if it makes fish babies or if they just die off. Okay? Number 5, no natural selection. So everyone is equally fit. What this means is that everyone has the same capability or the same ability to survive. So everyone's on the same playing field. So no one has an advantage, no one has a disadvantage. So what this means is that you don't have variations in a species. So thinking back to the beginning of the video, the chameleon, what was the chameleon eating? Bugs. Let's see. They were eating bugs, but why didn't he eat the green one? Because the green one was camouflaged into its environment. So the green one has an advantage to not get eaten because the chameleon can't see it. Okay? So in a perfect situation, that would not be the case. That chameleons could see the bugs no matter what color they were. And so he would eat them based on whatever he was feeling that day. So nothing to do with the variation of the individuals. All right, so this is your model. This is what your population should do. These are the rules that it should follow, but that is not what the real population is going to do. Very seldomly are your populations following all these rules at one given time. So then depending on what rules they're breaking, will depend on what type of natural selection, what type of evolutionary characteristic or mode of evolution is happening. Okay, so before we go on, a couple of vocabulary. So the first one is your gene pool. So a gene pool is not a literal pool that you can go swimming in. It is more of a figurative thing that is going to hold all of the available genes within a population. So again, if we're looking at our classroom as a population, our gene pool would consist of all of y'all's genes in your DNA, my genes in my DNA, all put together in a sort of, you can look at it also as a bank. So we're gonna put all of our genes in the DNA, and then that's what our offspring are going to have. Again, if we're looking at us as a population. Fitness is an organism's ability to contribute to the gene pool of the next population. So, a individual can either have a good adaptation or a bad adaptation, or it could not have an adaptation at all. And depending on how well it survives, using that adaptation or not using that adaptation, will determine its fitness. So if, thinking back to the bugs that the chameleon was eating, that green bug had a higher fitness than the other bugs, because that green bug, because it had the adaptation, the modification to camouflage into its environment, it had a higher fitness. It was more able to survive and reproduce than the other variations of that individual. So a measure of how well you are able to survive and reproduce is a measurement of your fitness. So not how well you can run a mile, but your overall ability to survive and reproduce. Yes, John?
Can genetic fitness help you with your fitness?
Yeah. Yes, you can be more genetically able to sustain a more fit body type than someone else, but for the most part, your genetics don't. I'm not gonna. No, we're gonna keep going. Okay. Okay. So the worksheet that you did yesterday, or that you should have at least started yesterday, right? Everyone has started working on the worksheet that I gave them yesterday. Definitely. Oh yeah. All right. So the worksheet that you got yesterday talks about a couple different types of natural selection, different modes of evolution. One of them being genetic drift, the second one being the bottleneck effect, and then the third one being the founder effect. So your genetic drift is the coming and going of your different genes. So in a population, what you have in the real world is you have species migrating and coming into and leaving populations. So that is genetic drift. Anytime you have a change in your gene pool, either the introduction of new genes from people or other organisms that are migrating into your population, or if you have genes leaving your gene pool because individuals or other species are leaving your population. So that is genetic drift. The bottleneck effect is a disaster, whether it be naturally caused or man-made, man-caused, that's even a word, but man-made or naturally. It is a disaster that drastically reduces population size. So natural disasters happen all the time, and what could happen is that a natural disaster could greatly decrease the population of a certain species. Or what we have seen more times than not is that because of humans have hunted different species almost to the brink of extinction, to where there's only been a few hundred individuals of that species left. So that would be an example of the bottleneck effect. So looking at this picture, so you have this population, you have some kind of disaster to where only a few of the individuals survive, and those individuals are going to be used to help the species bounce back and reproduce more offspring. Looking at this picture, what color marbles were left out of the new species, the new population? The yellow or orange, yes. So these ones were left out. They did not survive the disaster, whatever disaster it was. They did not survive, and so their genes were not able to be used for the next offspring to help them come back from that disaster. So the bottlenecking effect is usually a negative effect that's going to negatively affect the diversity of the species that has survived that disaster. Okay. So genetic drift is going to increase your diversity. The bottleneck effect is going to decrease your diversity. Okay. And then lastly, your worksheet talked about the founder effect. And did anyone start that part? Anyone read about the founder effect? What example did the worksheet give you? Okay, well, so you guys have more work to do. You need to work on that worksheet on your own. You need to do the worksheet. So the founder effect, the example that I gave you on your worksheet when you go to do it, is that there were a group of Amish, a very small group, that immigrated over to the Americas, to America, and it founded a population of Amish. And since you have a very small number of individuals who are starting that population, bless you, you have a very small amount of genes that are going to be able to be used in order to make offspring. So eventually what's going to happen is that your DNA is going to kind of get a little jumbled, and you're going to end up with offspring that have extra thumbs or extra toes. So that's an effect of the founder effect, because you have such a small amount of individuals starting out a new population of species. Yes, Tyler?
Basically, it's incest.
Yeah. Okay. So gene flow. So gene flow is basically the same thing as genetic drift. So you have genes coming into your population, genes leaving your population. So that is going to affect what genes are in your gene pool that are going to be used for the next set of offspring. Mutations, we already know that mutations is a change in your DNA. That change could either be good, bad, or it could be not any problem at all. It's just no effect at all. And then lastly, we have non-random mating. So non-random mating is the opposite of random mating. So non-random mating would be what like fish do. They just put their eggs out there, and they put their sperm out there, and they make fish babies, maybe, maybe not, who knows, because they swim off and they're done. Okay? Okay, so tomorrow you have your classification quiz. We'll do that first, and then afterwards we will try and finish the rest of these notes. We only have a little bit left. And then next week we will start wrapping up the unit, and you're going to have your test before you leave for spring break. Okay, so make sure you are getting your work done. Make sure you're studying, reviewing your notes. Study your classification notes for tomorrow.